Thank you, Tony, and good day, everybody. If we could go to the first slide, please. So I'm going to be talking about the update that we've made to what we think is the outlook for the airline industry in 2021. And let's just begin by looking at the starting point. So what you can see here are the industry's operating margins by quarter through to the fourth quarter of 2020. And we did see an improvement in the second half of last year from the second quarter low point. And that was despite no revenues, apart from cargo revenues, as airlines were downsizing their costs. However, many of those costs are fixed. We saw the improvement was only to 50% of revenues by the fourth quarter of last year. So quite a weak starting point. We move to the next slide. One of the things that we haven't seen are many airline failures in the face of such a dramatic financial shock. But the cost of survival has been a massive increase of debt, and that's partly because of government aid. Much of government aid has been in the form of debt that needs to be repaid, but also because airlines have been raising cash from the banks and the capital markets. We estimate that debt for the industry rose by more than $220 billion by the end of last year. And clearly that is going to shape how airlines have to use their free cash flow in the recovery period. Airlines will need to deleverage. This level of debt is not sustainable. If we move to the next slide, I mean, what the industry needs, of course, is for revenues to revive. This shows the volume of business, ton kilometers flown. The good news is that the cargo business continues to strengthen. And in terms of volumes, by February, we were 9% above pre-COVID-19 levels. That is a strong part of the business. Unfortunately, the bigger passenger business deteriorated in the early months of this year. Domestic air travel fell. That's largely because of what happened in China. Recall that the Chinese government asked its citizens to stay at home during the Chinese New Year. And actually, we know that in March, from the Chinese airline results, that we've seen a full rebound to the earlier levels. So that was a temporary problem. I think the bigger problem is with the international passenger business, which is still down almost 90%. And if we move to the next slide, the problem, of course, is the travel restrictions that we see. And these are measures of the restrictiveness of the border controls on air travel. And as you can see, although there's been some diminution, some relaxation since the peak of the crisis in the second quarter of last year, controls are still way above where they were in January before the crisis. And they, in fact, rose again in January, as we've seen the virus control situation deteriorate with the variants of the viruses. That has meant that we've seen very little international travel. And if we move to the next slide, vaccination will clearly make a difference. And we've seen some successes in this. If we look here at forecasts for when certain percentages of the population will be fully vaccinated, and this is the forecast by a science specialist, Airfinity, but we can see that the US and the UK are expected to have 75% of their populations vaccinated fully by July. So that should allow some international markets to open. And our forecast is based on a partial opening of international markets. For instance, the obvious one there is the UK, US. Continental Europe is not quite as advanced. Germany and France are expected to have fully vaccinated their high risk and healthcare population by the summer. But if we're looking at 75% of the population, it's not until October. So the key summer flying period is clearly at risk. And we have made the assumption that some markets will open, but others will not. And I think the broader point here is that if we look at some of the emerging markets, it's a much slower rollout of the vaccination. We will not see a widespread lowering of travel barriers, or unlikely, until next year because of the pace of vaccination. But if we move to the next slide, so the consequence of this is that we see some markets opening and certainly domestic markets picking up, allowing a much stronger second half. But we're not as positive about that as we were in December. In December, the red line, we were forecasting that on average this year, we would see RPKs at a level which was 51% of where they were before the crisis. We've now lowered that to 43% as a result of the delays in the vaccination rollout in some countries, and secondly, the deterioration that we're seeing today in the virus control situation. But what I would say is that it's entirely travel restrictions and the impact of the virus that is driving the weakness of international travel and the delay that we've seen to opening markets, because the broader economy is actually looking very supportive. What we've seen in global industrial production, for example, is a full recovery to considerably above pre-crisis levels, and actually business confidence is above pre-crisis levels. So outside of travel and tourism, the broader economy is looking in pretty good shape, and I think that this means, apart from strong demand for air cargo, it means that there is good reasons for thinking that there is pent-up demand to travel, and that potential travellers have got income and accumulated savings to spend once travel restrictions are lowered to allow such a recovery. And if we move to the next slide, you can see the basis of our forecast, the basis of that 2021 RPK forecast. So these numbers here, the black bars show our expectations for RPKs on particular travel markets in the second half of this year relative to 2019 levels. So the dotted line shows full recovery to pre-crisis levels. So actually we're pretty positive about the US domestic market. We're seeing bookings rise strongly there. And we also think the Chinese market will be above pre-crisis levels. We've actually seen that starting to happen already. But internationally, it's a very different picture. The partial opening of markets, we think, will help to lead to a better second half for Europe to North America, the North Atlantic, and within Europe. But we've sort of limited our expected growth there to recovery just under 50% of 2019 levels. And in Asia, where we're seeing governments, even where virus has been controlled, being very risk averse. And so we don't think there's going to be very much recovery in the second half of this year. That will be delayed into 2022. So a very mixed picture for 2021. If we move to the next slide, the same is true for cargo. The general picture for cargo is positive, but it does vary by trade lane. And if we look at the volumes flown on these trade lanes, we're seeing very strong markets across the North Pacific, benefiting US and Asian airlines. And we're also seeing strong growth on some of the Middle East segments, connecting via the Gulf hubs. By contrast, some of the European linked markets are relatively weaker, reflecting the relative weakness and indeed the lockdowns that we see today in parts of Europe's economy. So next slide, please. We are expecting to see strong cargo revenues, but as you can see from this slide, it's too small to make a difference for the industry as a whole. We're expecting to see some recovery of passenger revenues this year. Overall, though, we think that the industry is going to see total revenues 50, 60 percent of 2019 levels. So there's still a critical need for airlines to make sure that their cost base is downsized sufficiently, and perhaps more importantly, to make sure that supplier costs are kept under control as we move out in order to stop the inevitable cash burn. So that's the situation this year. If we move to the next slide, what I would say is that next year and the year after actually look much better. You know, the pace of vaccination, unless we see some of the variants prove very resistant to the vaccines, we're expecting that there'll be a very significant recovery of air travel in 2022, 2023. So that should benefit the financial situation as well. Challenges this year, and if we move to the next slide, you know, we think this is going to be a year of further losses. In fact, you know, because of that slower recovery in the second half, because of the international passenger market situation, we think that losses will be perhaps $47–48 billion this year, the blue bars. We had thought in December they'd be reduced to 38 billion. So you know, we've downgraded that expectation. What I would say though is that is a 2 to 3 times reduction in the losses we saw last year. So airlines are making progress. You know, it's moving in the right direction, but we think we're going to have to wait until 2022 for the industry to get back to break even or profitability. And if we move to the next slide, of course, the challenge and I guess the key metric for the industry still is cash burn. You know, the rate at which they're burning through their cash and near cash assets, because this determines survival or not. And the first quarter has been quite challenging, as you can see from that revised blue bar. But we expect the industry to improve as the year progresses, particularly in the second half. We don't now think that we'll see industry total break even in the fourth quarter. We had thought that in the fourth, but we think that's going to be delayed into next year. But I think one thing that has become apparent is that we're going to see a very different performance depending on the region. And if we move to the next and last slide, this shows operating margins. And I think what we are going to see, what we're already starting to see, is performance in North America and other regions with large domestic markets where we are expecting to see significant travel recoveries will benefit. And in North America, we're expecting to see losses reduced dramatically as a result of the strength of, essentially the strength of the US domestic market. But there's a contrast between the North American region and perhaps also the Asia Pacific region, which has got the big Chinese market, an Australian market, with Europe, where airlines are, to a very large extent, dependent on international travel. And actually, those forecasts that you see there for 2021 show a bit of deterioration from what we'd expected in December as a result of the loss of summer flying in some markets and the delays that we've seen taking place. So this year we're expecting to see quite a mixed picture, an improvement in all regions, but the pace of improvement dependent very much on the scale of domestic markets. Clearly the US and North American airlines doing relatively well on this view. Thank you.
We'll turn it over to Willie Walsh, our Director General, for a few comments, and then I'll remind everyone, please put your questions into the chat function. We'll get to those right after Willie's remarks. So Willie, over to you.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Brian, for your presentation, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm not going to speak for long because we are on a tight schedule and I want to give you all an opportunity to ask questions. But I think you can see from Brian's presentation that there is good news and bad. You know, the bad news shouldn't come as a surprise because I think it has been clear to everybody that the pace of recovery in the industry is slower than we had expected and slower than most people had anticipated versus what we were thinking back in December of last year. I think back then there was some optimism that we might see a pickup in the second quarter, the current quarter that we're in. It's clear though that that's now being pushed forward, and we're now looking at recovery in the second half. So the reduction or the increase in losses, the reduction in performance shouldn't come as a surprise. In fact, I think what might surprise some people is that we're not forecasting worse losses than Brian has shown in his presentation today. Clearly still a very challenging position for airlines, but I think there is some good news as well. The first thing I would say is that we are seeing a significant improvement in the financial performance, still making significant losses, but we've seen a 20+ point move in margin, and that's come from hard work. That hasn't been just falling to airlines. It's because airlines have taken all of the right measures, and they're beginning to see the benefit of the difficult decisions taken in 2020 coming through in the financial performance in 2021. And it's clear that airlines are continuing to look for opportunities to improve their financial performance, particularly given the slower pace of recovery. So I think airlines and their management teams deserve great credit for what they've done so far, because it clearly has been a very challenging environment. This crisis is without question the worst challenge, the greatest crisis we've ever faced. It's much deeper and has extended longer than anybody had expected. The other positives are when you look at the domestic markets, and that proves a couple of things. First and foremost, in these markets, there are very little, if any, travel restrictions. And from Brian's chart there, you can see China expected to be above 2019, the US domestic market to be broadly in line with 2019, and indeed talking to some of the CEOs there, I think they're even more optimistic than the presentation that Brian has given you. So we do know, and we clear evidence, that when travel restrictions are relaxed or removed, there is strong underlying demand, pent-up demand for travel. And that supports everything we've been saying, that once governments can manage the risk better than they have been doing and balance the risk between health and livelihood, lives and livelihood, then we should see relaxation in the restrictions that have been put in place, and that will lead to a pickup in travel. So the demand, when we talk about demand, we have to remind ourselves that that demand is significantly suppressed and depressed by the travel restrictions that are in place. So I think good evidence from the domestic markets, and indeed good evidence where international travel is allowed, be it the travel bubble that we've seen now between Australia and New Zealand. And I'm sure all of you looked at the fantastic images coming out of New Zealand yesterday or on Monday, when people were arriving and greeting their friends and family that they haven't been able to see in a long time. So good reason to be optimistic. Cargo performance has also been very good. And again, I think the industry deserves great credit in the way that they've responded to the underlying demand for cargo, given the significant reduction in passenger activity. Airlines have been able to put sufficient capacity on to meet the critical demand, and have been a very important, if not a critical part of the supply chain in ensuring that supplies of PPE and medical supplies have been transported to where they've been required. So the second half of the year certainly looks more positive than the first half, and I think we'll continue to monitor that. At this stage, what we believe is necessary is for governments to work with the industry. There needs to be a plan. We have years of expertise of managing risk and planning for these events. We know what is required. We know what work will need to be done to ensure that markets can be reopened as quickly as possible and full advantage taken of the potential economic recovery. And we need to work with governments. Risk management is in our blood. We do it on a daily basis, and that's why we have such a safe and secure form of transport, because we know how to manage risk. We identify risks. we put mitigating actions in place, we manage any residual risk, we never take risks that are not required, and that's a feature of our industry. So we know how to do it better than governments, and we would appreciate the opportunity to work with them. If they're not ready to produce these plans, we can help them produce them. Indeed, we are doing that in many countries where governments have looked to us for support and assistance in putting together a recovery plan. I think given that the crisis is extending longer than most people had expected, we need governments to continue to support the industry, particularly in the area of employee support schemes. It's critical that we retain the skills within the industry to enable the industry to recover. Without question, similar to many other industries that have been heavily impacted by this crisis, the airline industry would not have been able to retain as many of those employees with critical skills if it had not been for the support of the income support, employee support schemes that many governments have put in place. The recovery is going to take longer than we expected, and some of these schemes will be unwound as we go through the summer. I think it will be important for governments to recognise that it may be necessary to have sector-specific schemes in place, particularly for the airline industry. And as I've talked about on many occasions in my previous roles, and I will continue to do so in this role, cost containment, cost control, cost reduction is going to be critical to the future success of the industry. You know, the results you're seeing today, although disappointing, are much better than they would have been if it weren't for the tough decisions that airline managers have taken going through 2020 and into 2021. We need our suppliers, our partners in the industry to recognize that. We need them to be equally focused on cost control, and we're not seeing evidence of that, particularly with monopoly or quasi-monopoly suppliers. It is unacceptable for these suppliers to believe that they can recover losses encountered in 2020 by gouging from prices from the airline industry. We've had to take very significant pain. They should have been doing that too. They should have been adjusting their cost base to reduce their losses through the year. It's unacceptable for people to believe that they can just sit back and then recover those losses from an industry that needs to retain all of the cash it can generate to address the debt burden that has built up through this crisis. As Brian has demonstrated, $650 billion of debt, over $220 billion more since the start of this crisis. So we want our partners and suppliers in the industry to recognize the role that they need to play. But I'm optimistic. I think there's good evidence to support recovery in the industry. We've demonstrated the resilience of the industry. We've demonstrated that we are prepared to do what's necessary. And we're going to continue to work with the industry to ensure that once volumes increase, that they can operate efficiently. And that's where the IATA travel pass comes into play. We think this will be a critical facilitator to enable airlines and airports to function in an efficient manner once volumes increase. We cannot rely on paperwork to facilitate travel, either before the customer checks in or checks in at the airport and when the customer arrives at the destination. We have to have a digital solution because, as all of you will know, airports today have not been built to deal with the manual processing of every customer that flies. All of the airports that are operating today with high volumes of customers that they've been used to only function because airlines have online check-in or travel apps that enable them to do all of the routine transactions before they get to the airport. And that's where the IATA travel pass comes into play. So we're very pleased with the agreements we've signed with a number of key medical labs who will have direct access to the app. And we're very pleased with the cooperation that we're getting from many governments who I think recognize the value of the travel pass. So a lot of work that needs to be done, but good reason for us to be optimistic about the future. And on that, I'll hand back to Tony to manage the Q&A.
Great, thanks very much, Willie. We've got a few questions in the queue. Again, if you have a question, type it in and we'll try and get to them pretty much in the order they've come in, based on subject area, etc. So of the few questions we've got, let's start with one on travel restrictions. That's been mentioned a few times that travel restrictions are suppressing demand. And the question is, do you think that the travel restrictions are because governments believe that flying is not safe, or is it because of border control and not wanting to re-import the disease?
Well, I certainly don't believe it's because anybody thinks flying is unsafe, and there's plenty of evidence to show that it is safe. 2.4 billion passengers are expected to travel on aircraft in 2021 based on the figures that you've seen from Brian. And we've plenty of evidence now to demonstrate that flying on aircraft today is a safe means of transport. I think it's fair to say that a lot of governments are responding to the pressure that they feel from their citizens who have faced significant restrictions. And, I've read some emails that have been sent to politicians where people are saying, look, you're restricting me to my house. Why is it you're allowing people to fly in and out of the country? So I believe travel is safe. I think governments acknowledge that it is safe by virtue of the fact that travel continues in place today, with most flights being labelled essential, or people travelling being labelled as travelling for essential reasons. So without question, the industry has demonstrated the safety of flying on board the aircraft. What we've got to do now is demonstrate to governments that they can manage the risk associated with what's often described as the importation of the virus by putting measures in place that are that represent an acceptable management of what is a low risk, particularly when you have people who are being tested before they get on board an aircraft. And you've seen the comments we've made around the cost and the inconvenience of certain types of testing. We believe that the advances that have been made in testing methods should be availed of. There's significant evidence to show that rapid antigen testing is an acceptable risk mitigant, and there's no reason why people should be forced to pay the exorbitant charges that they're facing for PCR testing today.
Okay, thanks very much, Willie. In the same vein, we have a question about a study that was released by the CDC recently, and it seemed to imply that there is a risk in filling a significantly increased risk when middle seats are filled on aircraft. And the question is basically, does IATA have any comment on that?
Well, you know that every airline puts the safety and security of every passenger and every crew member and every colleague first and foremost in everything that they do. And I can tell you from past experience, if I believe that it was unsafe, I certainly, as a former airline CEO, wouldn't do it. I think these studies are interesting, and we clearly welcome any study that is done. There are lots of other studies who would counter the view being taken. And I think it's important also to remember, I think the basis of this study was on exposure rather than transmission. I don't believe it reflected the fact that wearing of masks is now effectively mandatory on board aircraft. And I'm not sure it reflected all of the other measures that have been taken since. But I know airlines will continue to evaluate this situation. But when you look at the number of people that are flying today, there's very little evidence of any transmission of the virus on board an aircraft. So I firmly believe that it is safe to do so. But we will look at all of these studies, and I'm sure airline CEOs will study it in some detail and consider whether they need to make changes as a result of any recommendations that are made.
Okay, thanks very much. We have a question about the situation in UK and the rest of Europe, as well as the UK to US. And the questioner basically asks, what can IATA do to help generate traffic in US, UK, as well as Europe in time for the summer period?
I'm pleased to say we don't need to do anything to generate the traffic because it's there. The demand is there. We know that from experience. We know that from the evidence, as we pointed to in domestic markets. We know what happens when travel restrictions are relaxed. We know what happens when people are able to travel. There's an immediate rebound in demand, and that's what we would expect to see if there's a relaxation. What we want to see is for governments to understand the risk associated with travel, particularly in an environment where vaccines have been significantly rolled out in the UK and the US, where testing has improved, and where there's now a lot of evidence that people can look to understand what the risk is. And I would think that in a situation where your fundamental freedom is being withdrawn from you, you would expect governments to take those actions based on hard evidence and hard data, and not based on anecdotal evidence or on how they believe it will go down with some of their electorate. So this is a serious issue. People have been deprived of their freedom to travel. In the EU, a fundamental freedom, one of the building blocks of the EU, has been taken away from people. Now, I can understand that when there is a health crisis and nobody is challenging the need to have appropriate measures in place. But as the vaccine rollout accelerates and as vulnerable people have been vaccinated and as the pressure on the health system reduces, because let's remember, that was the big fear, that health systems would be overrun by this pandemic. That fear has receded in a lot of countries. And where that happens, I think it is important for governments to review the measures they have in place. And once restrictions can be relaxed or removed, the demand will be strong. We are very confident that it will come back very quickly. So airlines won't need to do anything to generate that demand, because that demand is very strong, underlying pent-up demand that will be evident once the restrictions are relaxed.
Okay, thank you, Willie. We have a question about the IATA travel pass. And the questioner says that, first off, the travel pass depends on digital certifications, and governments are not progressing as quickly on digital certifications, for example, of vaccinations, as they are with actually distributing the vaccines. So does IATA see any progress in that area on the certification, I suppose, by governments, but also in terms of a global standard for that?
Yeah, we are seeing some progress. We've had good engagement from airlines. We now have over 50 airlines signed up, and it's increasing by the day. A lot of airlines expressing interest. We're also seeing governments come to us and say, we like this idea, we want to work with you. So I think there's a recognition. Now, if we were to stop all of the work we're doing and wait for these issues to be done, well then, clearly there would be a significant lag in bringing the app on stream for high volumes of people. What we're doing at the moment is testing it. We're getting excellent feedback. It's great to be able to test it with real customers in a live environment so that we can fine tune it and have it ready for when high volumes of activity restarts. So we have already signed agreements with a number of big labs where you can get a direct feed from the test to the app, and more work will be done. So I think it was important for us to have done all of this work. I know there are others doing it as well, and I welcome that. But it would be wrong for us to wait for governments to get their ducks in a row before we do this work. We want to be ready to be able to move very quickly, and that is the case with the app. I think excellent work been done so far, and more good work will be done as we go through this test phase with live customers.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about the forecast. And the questioner says, you said that there remains some optimism for the second half of the year. And the question is, what assumptions is that based on in terms of the restoration of intra-European travel and transatlantic flights?
I'll let Brian answer this, but I think you will see from his presentation that he was actually quite pessimistic about Europe, probably a bit more pessimistic than I would be. So maybe, Brian, do you want to address that specifically?
Yeah, I think much of our optimism revolves around domestic markets, actually. That is where we think the contribution to travel growth is going to be. We're seeing that already happening in the US market, and we know from the bookings that are in the pipeline that that market is rising very, very quickly. We know the same is true in China. We're making some assumptions of partial opening of markets within Europe and also across the North Atlantic based on the vaccination rollouts. I mean, by the fourth quarter, they should all be in place because the vaccine forecast suggests that the populations, 75% of the populations will be vaccinated. And as Willie just mentioned, in principle, governments should be able to open when the healthcare and the vulnerable are vaccinated. But just for reasons of offering a cautious view, we have made the assumption that we'll see some markets open for the summer flying within Europe, but not all.
Okay, thanks very much. Brian, another question for you. It says, given the massive amount of debt airlines are going to have after the crisis is over, even though the recovery is forecast for around 2024 to 2025, how long will it actually take for the industry to get that debt down and get their bottom line in order?
Well, I think airlines can return to generate cash and generate free cash flow and also become profitable again, probably next year, and in fact in some regions earlier. But there's this big burden of debt, and I think that that's going to be a critical thing for airlines to try to reduce, because it just constrains their ability to invest in fleets, in expansion, in new products. So I think a lot of that free cash flow, a lot of the profits when they appear, will have to be dedicated to paying down that debt. That's going to take years. So I think airlines are probably going to need to get new equity invested to help resolve that balance sheet situation.
Okay, thanks. Willie, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think Brian has addressed that.
Okay. We have a question about the US market, basically saying that there were travel restrictions brought in under the Trump administration between Europe and UK. These haven't been rescinded. In fact, the CDC or the US government has increased the level of travel warnings that have been put out. And I guess the question is, does IATA have any comment on that, or how disappointed are we or concerned are we about that increase in the travel warnings for US citizens?
No, I'm not concerned. I think, again, it was expected. I think it's CDC is just catching up with some other events and probably reflects what's happening at the moment. These are the restrictions that we're talking about. I think it will come to a point where these restrictions can sensibly be removed. As I said, nobody's arguing that you shouldn't have any restrictions when there is a health crisis. But once that health crisis has been addressed, or once there's confidence in addressing that, then what we believe is appropriate is that people set out a plan to remove the restrictions. And the more advance notice that can be given, the better for everybody. It will enable airlines to prepare to build up their network so that people will have the opportunities that they're desperate for. That's the central issue here. When restrictions can sensibly be removed, and we believe we're getting to a point where they can, and indeed in some markets they have been removed, then the airlines will be ready to recover and to give people the opportunity to start flying again.
Okay. Willie, you've previously made some comments about the monopoly position of suppliers and the potential for them to try and recuperate losses through higher prices. The question is, for airlines, what is the solution? What can the industry do to avoid those situations?
Well, it's always fascinating that when you look at the airline industry, when they're faced with a situation where there's weaker demand, they reduce their prices so as to encourage more people to fly, to maximize their revenue, maximize their cash, and hopefully improve their profitability. Monopoly suppliers take the view that, the people who are flying, we just charge them more. And they do that because they can, because there's no competitive pressure. They can get away with it. And what we need strong regulation. There is no question that where regulators are in place, some behaviors are better, but we need regulators to be strong. From my experience in the UK regulator was often very soft when it came to regulating airport charges. We've seen that improve over the years, but these regulators have a responsibility to consumers, and they need to balance that responsibility with their responsibility to fairly regulate the monopoly or quasi-monopoly entity. So we need strong regulation. We also need these people just to cop on and understand what's going on. It should be in their interest to see a strong airline industry. They're not going to see that if they try and kill it during the recovery phase. So now is not the time for people to look at putting up prices. Now is not the time for people to look at recovering losses. Now is the time to ensure that everybody is working together to ensure that the industry can build up as quickly as possible and get people back flying again, get people enjoying the freedom that has been taken from them over the past 12, 14 months, so that we can get back to living our lives in as normal a way as possible. I think most scientists would argue that we're going to have to live with this virus, that it will become, if it isn't already endemic, it will become endemic. And we've got to adjust to that, as we've adjusted to other health challenges around the world. So I firmly believe that this industry will recover and will recover strongly. And we will call out those who misbehave through this period. And we won't be shy about identifying people who are trying to hurt the industry during this recovery phase.
Okay, thank you, Willie. We have a question about testing. So, and also related to cost. So the cost of testing is significant, particularly if it's PCR. Many governments are requiring PCR instead of more cost-efficient methods of testing. The UK, for example, is mandating PCR for arrivals even from what they perceive to be low-risk countries. So the question is, I guess, twofold. One is IATA happy with the situation? Secondly is, what does our modeling take into account with respect to the cost of testing and demand? And what assumptions on the cost of testing underpin the forecast that we've put out? So maybe, Willie, did you want to start? And then for the forecasting bit, Brian?
Well, we're certainly not happy. I think this is outrageous. When you look at the fees that are being charged, there's clear evidence of gouging, of profiteering. I've seen it personally. I don't know how many PCRs each of you have had to take, but I've had to take several because of the flights that I'm taking. I look at the UK, where you're required, in addition to the PCR or the test before you fly to the UK, you then have to do a test on day 2 and day 8. And you have to buy a package in advance for day 2 and day 8, even if you're not going to be there on day 8, which is outrageous. But the cost of that is unacceptable. And, it struck me that when I paid the bill and saw the VAT that I was being charged, that here you have situations where government are mandating PCR testing. And in this case, it's really belt and braces PCR testing after you've arrived and after you're in self-isolation or quarantine, and charging VAT on top of it. This is unacceptable, and we need to address this. And it's clearly unacceptable that companies are charging the prices when there's strong evidence that these tests can be done at significantly lower cost. So I think we've got to challenge the need for PCR. Is it the only acceptable risk mitigant that can be put in place when there's significant improvement in both the quality and speed and price of other tests? And I'll hand over to Brian in terms of what we've modelled in, but our expectation is that these requirements will reduce over time, and the cost of these tests will reduce over time. And I'm actually surprised that consumer groups have not been focused on this issue. If we're doing these tests because there's a health crisis, government shouldn't be charging VAT. And if we're doing it because of a health crisis, people should not be profiteering off the back of it.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just add, the scale of the PCR costs for travel at the moment is probably taking, 65% or so off the passenger numbers that we would normally expect to be given the constraints. They are having a material effect on people's willingness to travel. We have assumed in the forecast that we will see that cost go very significantly down.
Okay, thanks, Brian. We have a question, Brian, for you on the scenarios you were talking about for the end of the year, and perhaps it's a good opportunity to clarify some of the numbers. So you have an optimistic and a less optimistic scenario where you have demand at 33 or 38%, but then today you also mentioned a 43% more optimistic number in terms of RPKs for the year. So could you just explain what's behind those numbers and how they interrelate with each other?
So what we've released today replaces those earlier results of research into the uncertainty that we were facing at the time. And I think what's changed since those earlier scenarios were released was what we've seen happening in in particular, the vaccination in the US and the strength of the US domestic market, and also the rebound in the Chinese domestic market. So that is the change. It's the strength of some of these big domestic markets. International travel at the moment remains as it was when we released those scenarios, but these numbers replace those. So we're expecting to see global RPKs 26% higher on average this year than it was in 2020, and that takes us to a level 43% of pre-crisis levels. So better, but not there yet.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Willie, a question for you, or actually a clarification. When you talk about monopoly suppliers, are you speaking primarily about airport and ANSPs?
Primarily, yes, airports and ANSPs, but they're not the only monopoly suppliers. But clearly, when you look at the cost base of an airline, airport charges and en route charges represent a significant proportion of the cost. But where we see evidence of other suppliers in the industry where we don't have a choice, it's not just, as I said, monopolies, it's quasi-monopolies, and I would point to some behaviors that we're witnessing from some of the OEMs. They don't represent the same scale of cost, but it's disappointing to see some behaviors that we're seeing at the moment.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of last questions in the queue, so if anyone has additional questions, please get them in quickly. The first of the last questions we've got refers to cargo. We've talked a lot about how contactless travel and sort of improvements in digitizing the passenger experience has been. How optimistic are you that we'll be able to accelerate the removal of paper from the cargo side of the business?
Yeah, I think great question, and I am optimistic. Not only is this important to enable the efficiency of the operation, but when you consider the amount of weight, believe it or not, that's been carried around on an aircraft because of all of this cargo paperwork, it's not required. It is adding to the weight of the aircraft, and as you know, we look at every kilo of weight that we have on the aircraft for fuel burn and environmental reasons. And I think there's a great opportunity to accelerate the work that we've done. I think IATA has been fundamental in improving the paperless travel from a passenger point of view. I'd like us to reinvigorate the work that we have been doing and to better engage with regulators. And that's where I think the pinch point is. We're seeing good responses. Like, I don't want to be overly critical here, because actually some countries have been very positive and actually have been pushing to have this work done on a digital basis, because they can see the benefit both in terms of cost but also quality, and the ability to keep better records of cargo that's being transported into and out of countries. So I think there is a great opportunity, and I know the cargo teams in IATA are working hard on that. But that's one of the things I think we will be prioritising as we start seeing the industry build back up again.
Okay. And then a question on, I guess, a slightly different tact, which references the ways that airlines work together, and specifically our alliances and joint ventures at the same level of relevance to the airlines after the crisis as they were before.
It's a great question, and just thinking about it quickly, I suspect they will be of greater relevance because of the damage that will have been done to networks. So in many cases, I think airlines won't be able to fully recover the network that they had in place, and will now look to serve customers by feeding traffic to one of their alliance partners. So I think as we go through this period of recovery, I would imagine that airlines will be working more closely with alliance partners to ensure that they can provide customers, consumers with as many options as possible, given that, without question, networks are going to be impacted by the effect of the crisis, and we're not going to see all of the flights and services that were operated in 2019 recovered immediately. And in fact, I would imagine some of the services that were operated will take some years to recover.
Okay. And I guess a follow-up question on that. Brian, you referred to essentially a multi-speed type of recovery with a lot of regional differentiation. The question is, what are the implications of an industry that's recovering at such dramatically different speeds?
I think it is that it's going to be a challenge for airlines to restore their networks to pre-crisis levels, because some of the markets will be shut. Now, I wouldn't expect that to continue beyond next year, given what we know about the vaccine rollouts. But clearly, over this initial period, it's going to be airlines are going to have to become cash positive on the networks that they can open, which is why those with large domestic markets we think will do relatively well this year. But it also emphasizes the importance of the alliance and the joint business relationships, those structures that airlines have set up. Those are going to be critical to sustain connectivity, which is not just important for the airlines, but it's important for the wider economies, connecting businesses, connecting trade as well.
Okay. That's the last question that we have in the queue. So we're just about at the half-hour mark. So unless Willie or Brian, you have any last comments you'd like to emphasize regarding the outlook?
Yeah, just a couple of brief comments, Tony. First and foremost, I'd like to agree with what Brian says there. I think the pace of recovery, we're talking about months, we're not talking about years. So I don't think it's going to have a fundamental structural impact on the industry. But as Brian said, there are segments that will recover faster than others. But I would expect to see the industry getting closer to a normal type of operation, although at lower volumes overall than in 2019 as we go through 2022. So just to say again, I don't think any great surprise in what Brian has told you today. It just reinforces what he has been saying in recent months. I think the scale of the losses clearly are very difficult for all airlines, but it's great to see that it's a big improvement on the losses that airlines were making in 2020. And as we sit here and look forward, I think good reasons to point to developments that we've witnessed in recent months that should give us confidence about the industry's ability to recover as we go through 2021 and into 2022 and beyond.
Okay, thank you very much. There are no questions in the queue, so I think with that, we'll call an end to this press briefing.